And we have two main motor systems. So we have what are called the lower motor neurons. So when you're just walking around, you're not thinking about it. You're mainly in these patterns of your lower motor neurons are firing and engaging the limbs by making these muscles twitch, by releasing literally dumping acetylcholine onto them. And in the neuromuscular system, acetylcholine, at least in mammals, causes contraction of muscle fibers. We also have what are called upper motor neurons, which reside in our neocortex, the outer shell of the brain, and which allow us to make deliberate actions. And so they can direct specific lower motor neurons to engage or not engage. And this is how we learn and engage in deliberate movement. And so when somebody is able to generate a lot of force or getting stronger without the hypertrophy, a lot of that is learning how to engage upper motor neurons to fire lower motor neurons in the correct sequence. Because any skilled powerlifter, of which I'm not, will tell you that the sequence of neural activation is very important. You think of something basic like a deadlift, and it seems so simple, right? You just pick up a weight, proper form. But assuming proper form and picking up a weight, there are two ways you can do this, right? You can think about grounding your feet and then contracting the posterior chain from the calves and hamstrings and glutes and lower back up, or you can imagine doing it from the lower back and pulling all at once. There are a number of ways to engage the sequence of motor neuron firing, and skilled lifters know how to engage the sequence of firing to put them at the best strength advantage. Getting stronger involves more contractile ability of the nerve to fiber synapse, what we call the neuromuscular synapse. So literally more transmitter, more acetylcholine dumped onto the muscle fiber so it can contract. There are changes in the muscle as well, right? Even genetic changes in the muscle as well, based on repeated strength training. But then there's the ability to bring more activation of lower motor neurons, so you can bring more activation of muscle fibers. And there's some interesting little quirks about the powerlifting community. For instance, the use of smelling salts. Not something I recommend, it's very common. Smelling salts are mostly ammonias, they're poison. And so when they're inhaled, people feel very alert because there's an innate hardwired system of when you inhale things that are dangerous, your whole brain wakes up immediately. And olfaction, smell is one of the most primordial senses by which we determine if we are in a safe environment. I always say there's kind of three main categories of smells. There's sort of yum, meh, and yuck. And so, the yuck stuff is generally poisonous or dangerous or infectious. I mean, let's just call it what it is. If you see vomit on the street, you generally recoil, right? If you see something that you don't know, like this tea is actually quite tasty, I like it, and I'll smell it, it's like, okay, it's great, but it's not like delicious smelling tea. And then there's certain things or people that we happen to just smell and we're like, well, you just want to huff more of that, right? And so that system is leveraged by smelling salts. People get very alert. What does that alertness do? That adrenaline in the body enables an activation of muscles by shuttling of fuel, etc. But also the alertness allows the lifter to bring more engagement of the upper motor neurons to the lower motor neurons, and thereby to contract more muscle fibers. In principle, and I know that and forgive me because the gym rats out there are going to tell me, well, it's not more muscle fibers, contractile ability, and type 1, type 2 fibers. But I get that, and we're trying to keep this somewhat top level.
So, short of inhaling a poisonous substance, which I assume over the long term is not going to lead to a desirable result.
Yeah, most of these smelling salts don't harm people if they don't bring it too close or use it too often. I don't recommend smelling salts unless people really know what they're doing. They're actually illegal as a performance enhancing tool in a lot of sports. There are things like caffeine. You're bringing more attentional engagement through the dopamine system, but mainly through the adenosine system and adrenaline. So adrenaline's an amazing molecule in the brain and body. So there's caffeine. These days, there's a lot of interest and use of, and I don't want to get people trying things or doing things that their doctor doesn't approve. So talk to your doctor, and probably don't touch this stuff at all. But a lot of people are dabble in kind of low-level supplementation, over-the-counter supplementation to enhance things like dopamine and norepinephrine, like L-tyrosine, for instance. Other people are using things that are more robust, stimulants, outright stimulants. And then, now there's actually a culture, and I do not recommend this because it can cause other problems, but unless there's a clinical need, people are taking things like cabergoline, which is a dopamine agonist that shuts down prolactin, and it just makes people hyper-focused, mental clarity. People are really into modafinil, armodafinil these days. A lot of the college students and kids are taking Ritalin, Adderall, modafinil, armodafinil. It's big in the office worker community. All of that basically funnels into the same common mechanism, which is to increase the amount of adrenaline, which is also epinephrine, released from the adrenals and also within the brain, an area called locus ceruleus in the back of the brain. It's kind of a sprinkler system on the whole brain. And when you drink coffee or any form of caffeine, or you ingest any one of the compounds I mentioned, you dump a lot of noradrenaline or adrenaline into the brain. It's a wake up signal for the brain.
Do you build a tolerance to that? Like, what's the downside of that over the long term?
Huge. And listen, the reason these compounds exist is that there are clinical needs. There are legitimate cases of ADHD, and people need these. And people vary in their responses, but I will say people who have a predisposition for anxiety, bipolar, mania, or schizophrenia can trigger episodes. These drugs look a lot like cocaine and amphetamine chemically. The abuse and kind of addictive potential is huge because they work so well. They find that sweet spot for 4 to 8 hours that they're able to work on a minimum of sleep. So there's a potential for abuse there. It's always good to pick examples that might actually be more meaningful. There are often sexual side effects. The arousal arc of sexual excitement involves being predominantly parasympathetic, meaning very relaxed for arousal. I don't know the age listeners of this podcast, but this is biology. Orgasm and ejaculation are actually very meaning sympathetic, not sympathy, although presumably it is in some cases. The sympathetic nervous system is more about alertness and arousal. So orgasm and ejaculation in males, but orgasm in both males and females is controlled by the sympathetic nervous system, which is a stress system. So what happens when people will ingest stimulants is they will reside at a portion of the arousal arc where let's just be blunt about it, they very much want to have sex, but they can't. That can happen unless the dose, outside of a very narrow dose range. So people who use stimulants are often very wired and driven, but have challenges there. So then there's the crash, because anytime you have a big peak in dopamine, there's inevitably a trough that mirrors that peak.
So you can't have it all.
You can't have it all. And my colleague Anna Lemke at Stanford wrote a book, Dopamine Nation. She also was on Rich Roll's podcast about addiction and this playing pressure balance. It's not just about addiction to compounds like heroin, cocaine, amphetamine. Of course, it's that too. But for instance, anytime we have a peak experience, that peak experience can have a long tail on it, but there will always be a trough afterwards in which dopamine feels low and we feel kind of underwhelmed and kind of depressed. The typical mode of action is to take more of the compound or try and engage in more of the activity that brought that dopamine peak. However, the problem is with each subsequent engagement in that compound or that activity, you get a lower and lower peak, but the trough gets bigger and bigger. And this is how people drive themselves into addictions of different kinds, behavioral addictions and other kinds of addictions. And I'm not puritanical with respect to this. Like I take supplements. I'll occasionally do a pre-workout that I prefer to use something in the cholinergic system like alpha GPC or something like that. I don't react very well to L-tyrosine. I do drink caffeine, but I'm very conscious of, for instance, not doing too many workouts or work bouts, mental work bouts, where I'm doing caffeine, taking something to boost dopamine, listening to a lot of music, going into peak experiences like that, because there's a cost. And the cost is that you can't come back and do it every day. And I'm of the belief that most things that prolong your well-being and that build solid structures of success into your life are about what you can do on a daily basis, if not 5-day-a-week basis, not what you can pull off, just once or twice.